Wellness and Recovery webinar. This is the second webinar in our May webinar series. And today we're going to talk through what a recovery service really looks like. My name is Meg Beyer. I work at the McSilver Institute, and I'm part of the Managed Care Technical Assistance Center team. As part of this webinar, we worked collaboratively with our partners, our technical assistance partners, whose logos you see represented on this slide, to develop this Recovery and Wellness series. Our partners who are with us today on the webinar will introduce themselves shortly, but we also wanted to say that we worked closely with our state partners to develop these slides and the content as well. A few things, for those of you who might have missed out on the first webinar offering that happened last week, Wednesday, this recording has been posted to the MCTAC website. Additionally, there are extra details and resources there as well. We have been putting together trainings based around recovery and wellness since last fall, and we would recommend that you visit the MCTAC website to see what other parts and resources we've developed as part of this HCBS roadmap. The other thing I want to say today is that there are going to be some chat box questions that appear, and we recommend that for you to respond, you select to respond to all panelists so that all of our presenters today can see your responses. With that, I'm going to ask our colleagues to put a poll question up on the screen so that we can get a sense of who's on our webinar today. So if you could just take a minute and fill out that poll. We'll be back in a couple seconds with the responses, and then we will get started with our webinar. So we're excited to see who's joined us today. If you could just take a few seconds and let us know, we'll get started shortly. So for those of you who have just joined us this morning, welcome. We are getting started with our webinar today by asking you to fill out a poll question. We're curious about who's joining us on the webinar today. So if you could just take a couple seconds and answer the poll, that would be great. Okay, so thank you to those who were able to answer our polling questions. We're getting a sense of who's on the webinar with us today. So it looks like we have about 20% are OASIS providers, about 42% are OMH, 12% DOH. It looks like, I can't really see all the questions at the moment, but we have a variety of different staff members on here as well. And a variety of different services that are offered. So we'll take a look at these a little further down the road as we're doing this webinar. Thanks so much again for responding to our poll question this morning. So with that, I'm going to pass the presenter ball to my colleague Ruth, who will take us from there.
Thank you so much, Meg, and thank you, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you all this morning on this beautiful, beautiful morning. My name is Ruth Cologne-Wagner, and I am the Director of Training and Development with NIAPRS. And I'd like also our partners who are on this webinar with me today to also introduce themselves at this time. And so first we'll have Carla introduce herself.
Thank you, Ruth. Good morning, everyone. My name is Carla Licio, and I'm with the National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse and the Managed Care Technical Assistance Center. And we also have with us today Sapana.
Sapana, you might need to unmute yourself.
That helps. Thanks, Ruth. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Sapana Patel. I'm the Director of Strategic Planning and Curriculum Development at the Center for Practice Innovations, and I'm very glad to have you all joining us today.
Wonderful.
Ruth?
And with that, we will get started. So let's begin our presentation today with a review of the learning objectives for today's webinar. What does recovery services really look like? First, we will identify the 7 components of a recovery-oriented service, and we will work to understand the important characteristics of each of those components. And we will consider ways to develop your agency or your service's readiness to become more recovery-focused. Recovery review. Wonderful. So before we embark on looking to create a recovery-oriented services, it's really important for us to do a review about what recovery is. And I hope you were able to join us last week at our webinar. But this definition in front of you was created by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, back in 2011, and this is their working definition. And I'd like to read this to you, and then I'm also going to share with you the definition that we shared with you last week, because we find that also very relevant. And so this definition is: recovery is a process of change whereby individuals work to improve their own health and wellness and to live a meaningful life in a community of their choice while striving to achieve their full potential. And in your research, you might see that there are a few definitions of recovery, and the definition that we reviewed last week at our Recovery Relationships webinar was by Anthony Cohen, Farkas, and Gagne, I hope I'm saying that last name correctly, back in 2002 from Boston University. And they describe recovery as a deeply personal, unique process of changing one's attitudes, values, feelings, goals, skills, and or roles. It's a way of living a satisfying, hopeful, and contributing life, even with the limitations caused by the illness. Recovery involves the development of new meaning and purpose in one's life, and one grows beyond the catastrophic effects of the illness. And I've got to tell you, both of these definitions are valid, but for me, when used together, they really speak to me as a practitioner, and they really speak to the uniqueness of everyone's recovery journey. I am now going to pass the ball along to Carla.
Thanks, Ruth. I appreciate that. So in reviewing what the definitions of recovery, we couldn't help but not stop and take a look at some important components of what a recovery-oriented system of care looks like, and in particular, a component that is very important to the substance use disorder field. So in terms of the basics of effective treatment in a recovery-oriented system of care, in particular for substance use disorder providers, combining treatment medications with behavioral therapies is truly the best way to ensure success for most patients. Approaches that are tailored to address the specific treatment needs of the individual, of course, are critical, and that includes medication-assisted treatment. I think it's a really important piece to reinforce here that medication-assisted treatment really works. Medication-assisted recovery is a practical, accurate, and non-stigmatizing way to describe a pathway to recovery made possible by physician-prescribed and monitored medications, along with other recovery supports. It's important here to understand that truly the evidence is completely supportive of medication-assisted treatment as a critical option for individuals on their path to recovery. And so we wanted to just make sure that that was emphasized as part of the definition of recovery, that medication-assisted treatment is absolutely consistent with recovery. And with that, Ruth, I'm going to return the controls back to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Carla. What you see in front of you, everyone, are 4 domains that support recovery, and this also comes out of SAMHSA. And when we look to help people find recovery, it can really be as simple as thinking about what our own needs are. These are 4 domains that support recovery: health, home, purpose, and community. And this is the foundation of what all people need to have a fulfilling life. And we can't find recovery if we don't work on our health, and that's the first domain. To be able to overcome or manage one's illness for us, and for us to be physically and emotionally healthy. And I want to go back to really what I said in the beginning of talking about health: overcoming or managing. And it's just important to know that the amelioration of symptoms is not necessarily the goal. The goal is to have a full and healthy life, and we can do that as well sometimes with symptoms. Now for home, we also need a safe and stable home with supports that help people, that help us in our recovery. And next, what is our purpose? I mean, what fulfills me? What feeds my soul? You know, is it employment? Is it friends? Is it family? Is it hobbies? Is it all of those things? Socialization, political affiliations, civic duties. There are so many things to think about when we think about our purpose in life. And lastly, community as the last domain. Who's in our social circle, right? And the relationships that we have and the relationships that we can create. And so our basic fundamental needs, everything falls into these 4 domains. This is what we need to recover, and ameliorating symptoms, as we said, is really very important, but let's also remember to value the full life and to help people achieve that, and that is the foundation of recovery. I'm now going to pass the controls over. Here we go, Sapana.
Thank you, Ruth. That was a great sort of overview of recovery. I think, you know, reminding us of what's important in terms of our role as providers and what's important to the persons that we serve. What I'm going to do is for a moment just zoom out and talk a little bit about SAMHSA's 10 guiding principles of recovery. And this is relevant to transition the content of what we're presenting today to kind of give our participants a sense of some of the principles of recovery and how this may be relevant to establishing a recovery-oriented agency or services, and start working towards that. So in review, I'll say that some of the guiding principles of recovery include sort of the installation of hope and the relational nature of recovery. Our relationships really are so fundamental to recovery. And another important piece would be that this is person-driven and culturally sensitive, mindful of the fact that there are different cultural practices and different customs that may be quite important to recovery, and it doesn't always just rely on what evidence-based treatments or services that are out there. It may be relevant to a person's family, home, religion, or cultural practice. There are, in that similar spirit, many pathways to recovery. Recovery addresses trauma and is holistic. It identifies the strengths and the person's responsibility and their autonomy in the recovery process, as well as respect for persons, as well as peer support that may be very important in the process of recovery. And now what I'll do, because really, we've done a lot of talking so far, and what I want to do is to open the floor up to our participants today to understand with our first chat box questions, what are some aspects, and thinking about, sort of at the person level, what's important for recovery, as well as at the agency level. If I could just ask our participants to give us some feedback on two aspects of your agency and services that are consistent with a recovery orientation. So if you can, just think about, your colleagues, your workplace, your agency, some of the mission and the purpose. And if you can just take a few minutes, and I'd invite our participants to list two aspects of their agency that are consistent with recovery. And we'll just hang on a few minutes for folks to give us some of their thoughts on this question. And so we're getting some responses, confidential services, services that are non-judgmental, peer support, recovery, and a wellness facility. Meeting the clients where they're at, working on SMART goals. Those are all great answers. An agency that includes person-centered plans, person-directed care, again, providing person-centered services that are aligned with client goals. And this is also important to recovery. I'm seeing a lot of peer support focused on hope and empowerment.
Sapana, someone mentioned SMART goals, and I think it might just be a good idea for us to say what that is in case not everyone knows. And I had forgotten, so I quickly looked it up. And it's specific, measurable, agreed upon, realistic, and time-based. So that absolutely does support person-centered care.
I'm so glad you did that, Ruth. I jumped on the idea of SMART goals, too. I thought that was a terrific addition, and I'm glad that you've had an opportunity to define that. Could you say that again?
Sure. We've got SMART goals. The acronym SMART stands for specific, measurable, agreed upon, realistic, and time-based.
Thank you, Ruth. And I think
Sure.
the idea with the SMART goals is that, so important in person-centered planning is to find a way to engage with clients and have them participate in putting together plans. And the SMART framework and the SMART goals really sort of provide a way for practitioners to engage people. So if there's a goal that's identified, to try and be specific about it, try and measure to understand in what period of time a person would like to work towards their goals, something that's achievable, again, within their abilities and capacities at the moment, and speaking to sort of also, the ability to work on some of these goals in a specified time frame is also important, so that we can track over time when we work with a person if they're making progress towards their goal. And to be helpful and supportive in ways that then can continue their work on these goals.
Some of these are so good. I just want to mention Kelly Curran, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. She said employment first, and I just really wanted to highlight that because historically, you know, in the very traditional model of working, when you're not working through a recovery-oriented lens, you would think that a person would need to be quote-unquote ready for work. But the employment-first model really fits in to recovery-oriented service design because if a person is interested in employment, they are ready, just by the very nature of them saying that. And so, Kelly, thank you so much for adding that. It's important for all of us to know that employment is first. Employment helps with the healing. We don't have to heal before we are employed.
That's really awesome, Ruth. And I wondered if it would be okay. I'd like to highlight another thing that I'm seeing here. This is Carla. I'm seeing here an emphasis on providing individuals that are in treatment with a whole full menu of options and choices so that programs are not tightly and structured and rigid so that an individual has to fit into the program, but rather the program is flexible and meets the needs of each individual person. So I wanted to, that's another very important part of a recovery-oriented system of care.
Yes, it is. I'm glad you mentioned that. Funny thing, I will be mentioning that later on in the presentation.
Sorry, Ruth, I didn't mean to steal your thunder.
Okay.
But I do want to say that those came from our providers on this call, and I think it's just terrific.
That's right. We have a great group today.
We do. We certainly do. So with all of these, you know, we've got a lot of great responses to how there may be aspects of recovery within a person's agency and services. So I just want to move on and ask the group to identify also some things that, you know, we've reviewed several principles and domains of recovery, and I think we want us to also think about, you know, constantly thinking about how can we do more? What are some things that agencies or services have not yet achieved in order to consider itself recovery-oriented? And so I'd open up the floor again to our participants who've provided us with some great ideas and feedback on what recovery-oriented systems look like, and have them tell us a little bit more about where they'd like to continue to work towards achieving recovery-oriented services. So we'll just wait a few minutes while our great participants answer some questions for this next question.
It'd be great if we had a little music here or something.
Yeah.
I'll have to work on that for another webinar.
Like Jeopardy.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking, Ruth.
All right, for next week.
Oh, so this is an important one that's coming in. Putting treatment plans that are in the patient's words and not ours. That's so key. I think language is so important when it comes to recovery, and I think it really, you know, whenever I've worked with someone and used their words, it has different meaning, and it puts you know, sort of a different motivation behind working towards recovery, and I think that's so important. Let's see, we have some more responses coming in now.
I see the trauma-informed care coming in, and that's really important. That is a very important component. I know that this is a response to what would you like to see happening, and I think that it's great that people are able to identify things like trauma-informed care training, because I think that everyone on the webinar would probably agree that there are so many training needs and workforce development needs. It should be recognized that these are important, and it's as long as you build it in as something that you can do within a bigger work plan, it's going to take some time to get all your systems up to speed.
You know, I see the next one from Eve about a constant balancing act, having to justify functional limitations and medical necessity. And, you know, it really, it may seem all that difficult in the beginning, but when you think about a person's strengths and their barriers and what it is that they'd like to achieve, those can easily be translated into medical necessity. It's just a matter of working at that.
That's a really good one that just came in, moving away from telling how the patient should work their recovery maintenance plan and working the plan that they see as being the way to recover.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'm seeing that balance of power and control to, you know, you're a co-pilot with the person that you're working with.
That's right, and they have to drive their plan, whether they're driving the plane or the plan, they're in control.
Whatever they're driving it.
Yep.
I'm seeing another interesting
one. I'm seeing another interesting one, you know, working with past traditional treatments to try more holistic and wellness tools like journaling, deep breathing exercises, affirmations, creeds, prayer. And we talked a little bit about this. You know, there's not one pathway to recovery. And I think that, you know, thinking about and talking to people about what helps them, what already helps them, and a lot of that may be just very much outside of what is traditional. And so I think that's also a really important piece of feedback from our participants. That's great. I think it underscores the idea of asking what a person prefers and not just providing them with a menu of options. That's also very important.
These were really terrific responses. I love where people are at, thinking through really important things. But, Sapana, I'm wondering if maybe we need to move along to the next section so we don't run out of time on our webinar.
Absolutely. So I think that with these responses, we've heard from our participants about, you know, what is already within their agencies and some of the edges in terms of recovery-oriented systems that they'd like to work for the future. So how do we plan for change? How do we shift to recovery-oriented services? And really, just this slide is really just sort of meant to provide you know, a contrast of how we're sort of changing to a new paradigm. We're moving from episodes of illness to managing population health. In the spirit of integrating our systems, we're working away from fragmented care, more towards collaborative care, where there's a team that works with you to manage your, not only your social service needs, but as well as your behavioral health and mental health. It's less specialty driven and more driven by primary care. You know, in the old days, we had, you know, files that we passed back and forth, and now we're having more infrastructure with electronic health records that are integrated to enable conversations between providers. We're moving more from towards evidence-based medicine, more from, you know, volume to value, and really thinking about how we can all share the risk and reward in providing quality services. And in that similar spirit, you know, more of a cooperative payer-provider relationship. And so some of, you know, throughout your agency, there will be more thinking towards some of these paradigm shifts and how we're working towards the future, not necessarily everyone for themselves, but really coming together and, you know, even at the contracting level. So just to take a minute and to open it up to the participants, has this paradigm shift begun to occur in some ways? Are you seeing some of these things happening already? And which are you experiencing now? And I just like to open it up again to the folks to provide us with some feedback on what they're seeing within their agencies.
Again, that Jeopardy music might come in handy here. So some folks have said there's more collaboration among providers and between agencies, and that speaks to some of the relationships that are starting to form and forge forward. Okay, we'll get some more. Improved care coordination across agencies. And again, I think some of that is just so key to our moving towards providing sort of less of a fragmented system, scheduling regular treatment meetings, discharge planning. Let's see, we have some more coming in here. Okay, let's see. Might have a few more responses coming in here. Instead of focusing on what is wrong with a person, focusing on strengths. So that may be a shift in the organizational culture.
And it's great because when you focus on strengths, that helps you identify the barriers that you can work on. And then the person sees success so much quicker, and they gain hope so much faster.
Well, so one person mentioned having more information available through Psyches, MAPS, and RIO, and this is so important also because, you know, I think these are systems that really provide us with feedback on how things are going and allow us to have access to information about folks that may be sitting in front of us that we traditionally may not have had. So this is also another way to shift towards more collaboration and information sharing to provide the best care. So I think what I'll do is I'll move us on and pass the presenter role over to my colleague Ruth. And Ruth, you can take it away from here. And
great. Thank you so much, Sapana. Really, really appreciate it. Love those chat box questions. And so what we're going to do right now, let me just change the slide. We're going to actually discuss what are the characteristics of a recovery-oriented service and what that would look like. And here you find components of a recovery-oriented agency or services, and these 7 components of recovery-oriented services design was developed by Chaklu Mathai back in 2011 for the Recovery-Focused Capability Assessment Tool, and that was adapted from the University of Boston model for psychiatric rehabilitation. So right now, we're just going to go through each of these 7 components, and we're going to begin with component number 1, services design. And so when you think about services design, think about your mission statement, your vision statement, policies and procedures, and review them to ensure that they reflect your values of recovery and person-centeredness and having people involved in their care and in self-determination and in their growth potential. And ensure that your outreach is consistent with consistent and ongoing, and that you engage your community partners and your referral sources in this consistent and regular outreach. We also want you to consider to examine your services and if they flow or are they consistent with people's goals and objectives that they've put forth and that reflect their and your priority for self-help and for peer support. We're going to continue the next slide here with services design. And so additionally, when you design recovery into your space, you want to increase self-determination in every corner. So place community brochures, for example, at your site and other resources, including natural services that people can go to and they can initiate that and that they can help themselves. Provide flexible hours of service if that's a possibility for you, and provide culturally and linguistic choices. Not everyone speaks or chooses to speak English, and so to be able to have those options is really very important. And including a choice of practitioners, and it doesn't just necessarily have to be based on language. For example, I may speak the same language as that practitioner, but I may have an affinity for working with someone else, and so to be open to that possibility. And to also be flexible in your services and in your locations when you have that ability. And when crisis arise, really to look at this as an opportunity for growth. This can be an opportunity for healing and for learning, and the person going through the crisis can really have a responsibility for their wellness as long as they're working with you and that they see this as an opportunity for growth. And lastly, although it's not written on the slide, a good rule of thumb is to not fit your participants or your clients, if you call them clients, into services, but to fit the services into their lives. And that's what's so wonderful about HCBS services, that you're able to really have that flexibility and fit it into people's lives. And remember, life should not become treatment, and treatment should not become a person's life. So remember, it's, as we said earlier, it's about helping people to get and live a happy and a full life. The second component is the physical environment. And so provide visible, hopeful messages on the walls, for example, of people working, of financial security, of home ownership, leadership, educational achievements, and have intentional messages of belonging. And by that, I mean, have examples of pictures and resources, diversity of disabilities, diversity of cultures, of genders, ethnicities, and races, and just a place that says everyone belongs here, and so that this is actually visible. And provide resources, outcomes, help people to achieve their goal by giving them visualization, giving them resources that they can achieve those outcomes by, providing them resources on how to find work, how to create a resume, for example, how to find financial security, financial assistance, housing security, independence, for example, self-help, mutual assistance, and resources on peer support opportunities. And although some of this may not be in your control, that your facility is accessible by public transportation, and to also be accessible to people with physical disabilities. It's important for people to be able to access your services. So the location of your services is highly critical, and obviously accessibility to people with disabilities. Sometimes it just to put this into perspective, we can really become accustomed to the spaces in which we work, and as a result, we may not be as sensitive to our space as new people are, visitors are when they walk in. So when you think about your space, keep these things that we talked about in mind, and work to provide an environment that's inviting and it's recovery-oriented. All right, so we're going to continue here with the physical environment component. You can also consider to post messages of inclusion and community through your bulletin board or postings of community activities and other resources. Remember, this is about community involvement, and that's one of the 4 domains that support recovery from SAMHSA. So you really want to, in your organization, provide every single opportunity for a person to actively engage in their community and provide and get that recovery support independently. Also, examine your space and honestly get rid of the us versus the them and create non-segregated environments. You might have those spaces now, staff-only spaces like staff bathrooms or staff eating areas. And I've got to tell you, I was there too. I used to be the Director of Adult Treatment and Rehabilitation at a program in the Hudson River region, and it was incumbent upon me, once I learned about recovery, to then take it upon myself to start moving the culture of my organization, of my services, to one that was recovery-oriented, and that very clearly meant that we needed to do away with the us and the them. And so we took our staff bathrooms, and they no longer became staff bathrooms, they became everyone's bathrooms. And that really did help to move the facility and the culture of myself and of my team to recovery orientation, and really did open us up to be able to accept more and more changes. Also, look at your group rooms and other clinical spaces, and make spaces for people to socialize and to connect outside of those clinical spaces. And also help to open up their world, as well as to foster, self-determination, as we keep saying, by giving them access to computers, to the internet, to telephones, help them to help themselves, and by giving them connections to the outside internet world. Okay, staffing. So this is a big one. When hiring for new staff, this now becomes a critical juncture for supervisors in particular for setting organizational priorities. Hire only people who believe in recovery. This will help achieve their personal goal, right? The person's personal goals, and it will help the organization to meet its outcomes. The second bullet, people with a lived experience are typically hired as peers or peer specialists, and they're very, very valued. This is a very highly valued role. But people, being people, means that people with a lived experience come from all backgrounds, have varying academic degrees, hold high positions. So make sure that their experience is valued and that it's an additional experience that improves your service delivery. People with a lived experience hold roles from facilities to support staff to clinical staff to managers and CEOs. Ensure that your organization values this experience. And 3 is the self-disclosure. As clinicians, we can share a bit about ourselves, by being human, basically just being human. I work with someone that to this day remembers when I shared with her, quote unquote, we all go through hard times. We have to dust ourselves off and try again. I didn't think I was necessarily giving too much of myself, but I gave enough of myself that it normalized her experience. And by my normalizing my experience, it served as a catalyst for her of hope and of change. And she still reminds me of that to this day, so I'm very happy with that. And well, the last one here on this slide is, yes, when we design recovery-oriented services, we value not just the experience, but the unique role that peers bring to our services. All right, let's begin now with training. We've got about 11 more minutes left, and we want to make sure to go through the rest of the presentation because we're hoping for you to have questions at the end. So the fourth component here is training, and although we're all so busy with the day-to-day work, it's important to the quality of our work that we receive consistent training to expand our knowledge and skills, and that through consistent supervision, we turn that knowledge and skills into competencies in order to improve our work. So number one here, through training and supervision, to focus on quality of life, the whole life. To ensure we learn and practice in a person-centered and culturally competent manner. I would add trauma-informed manner as well. 3, and to ensure the staff are trained in core competencies to assist people with their quality of life outcomes. And that includes teaching them about benefits planning. Some people are so afraid to work because they just don't know the value and benefits out there that are in place to help people slowly transition into work while still maintaining their benefits. There are work incentives, that's part of that. Person-centered and trauma-informed services, connecting and coaching skills, and of course, cultural competences. And of course, have a system in place to acknowledge the good work of your team. Staff, you know, you work hard, and this is really hard work, and the workloads are really high. Support a system to acknowledge staff for their outstanding performance. Service provision. Okay, so let's ensure that your assessment in a service provision, you need to assess it, right? So let's ensure that your assessment is reflective of a person's hopes and dreams. As we are all individuals, we each have our own perspective about who we are and where we want to go. And have it be reflective of their strengths, their culture, their barriers, concrete barriers or perceptual barriers that they face. And 2, recovery planning, that the recovery plan is person-centered and that it incorporates aspirations and qualities that you learned, that you garnered from their assessment process. And then 3, specifically regarding the plan, that it clearly represents the person's priorities and puts them, just like you said earlier in the chat boxes, it represents their priorities and it puts them into real personalized and actionable steps towards their new life that they're seeking. I think we have one more slide on service provision. Yes, we do. And as you design your service provision, to focus on activities that build hope and foster relationships. This is not hokey. This is really, really something that's very powerful. And when people lose hope, one of the best things that we as practitioners can do is believe in them and lend them our hope until theirs slowly, slowly builds. Connect to people and to others. Connect them to people and to others who have been able to succeed in achieving one or more of those goals. That connection with people who have been there and done that and have experienced similar struggles is very, very powerful. And lastly, also look at how to engage families to support the person you're working with. As part of the 4 domains of recovery, people need people. Family, friends, community. So not only do they form our social network, but they can serve as allies, as natural support systems, and as hope builders when times become difficult. Our next component is discharge planning. And probably one of the most common sayings in our profession is, discharge begins upon admission. I know we all know that, and it's so true. So let's look at bullet number 1. When we focus on recovery from the outset, people will begin to feel hopeful because recovery does happen. You have seen it happen as a provider, and you have helped someone to achieve it. And when presented in that fashion, discharge becomes less of a scary thing, and it actually helps to build hope. The second bullet here, part of discharge is leaving treatment sometimes or leaving formal support. So for healing and wellness to continue, we rely on natural supports and peers in the community. So help to foster their success by building those natural supports in the community. It's important for us to know, take a step back and note that discontinuing professional services may be less of a desired outcome if we want to be inclusive of the SUD perspective. And discharge can be fearful. We know that because people will want service again. They would want support again if they need it, and sometimes they're just scared, what if I need it again, can I get it? And so you as a provider, let them know that there is a path to being able to come back to services again if that is needed. And lastly here, when people leave, it's a good idea to celebrate endings. Endings can be hard, and some people, organizations or services conduct ceremonies, and that's wonderful, but I want you to think about endings. It can be as simple as a card. It doesn't have to be anything extravagant. Quality improvement. So let's look at this. When assessing your services, decide on measures that highlight person-centeredness, recovery-oriented, cultural competency. You may also want to incorporate trauma-informed practices as measures as well. Sapana, in a few slides from now, will go over some of the outcome measures for you to consider. Also create a quality improvement team and broaden this team outside of clinical staff and even management staff. And think about your peer staff. Think about family members of people that receive services with you. Think about also community partners. And also, we have organizations that usually conduct annual satisfaction surveys, and that's wonderful. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's only once a year, and we want you to consider to increase, when you do this, and also increase the variety. So think about suggestion boxes, additional surveys. You can even do integrated feedback sessions. And if you don't know what that is, just a real general overview is that's where the clinician and the person receiving services together decide, hey, how was today's session? What's the feedback to and from? And that's also very, very telling and good for the clinician to return back to the supervisor and helps with supervision. And of course, it helps with the overall improvement of recovery-oriented services design for the program. And lastly, for complete transparency, post all feedback and advisory board minutes. I think I didn't mention advisory board. That was one of my recommendations for, suggestion boxes, surveys, integrated feedback. You can also consider forming an advisory board. And so for complete transparency on that bulletin board, that is also a good idea to place those minutes of those advisory board meetings. And lastly, we have, lastly for me, we have service evaluation. And as you're designing your recovery-oriented service, you need a way to evaluate how you're doing. In our next webinar, webinar number 3, Transforming Agency Culture, we're going to go into depth into one particular mechanism to create and maintain change, and that's the PDSA, the Plan, Do, Study Act. We'll do that in the next sessions. For service evaluation, during your evaluation, we want you to remember a major priority are the needs of the people that you work with. That has to be at the forefront of everything that you do. Prioritize recovery and in creating linkages for successful community integration. It all, again, goes back to those 4 domains of recovery and help them integrate into the community. And remember, treatment should not be their life. So when you open up a person's world by expanding their outreach into the community, they now have the same resources that everyone else does and the same ability to recover and find healing and happiness. Also, examine your policies and procedures and modify them to take into account person-centeredness. Have you ever heard of the 3 strikes you're out rule? That's been designed by some organizations to set off like an automatic discharge when someone doesn't show or call for 3 times. There is a real practicality to this, and I see that for the provider, but there is no practicality to it for the person receiving care, and it's absolutely not person-centered. A person-centered approach would put value on the outreach and the engagement practices as core competencies and core responsibilities of the provider. So the 3 strikes are out rule misplaces that responsibility and puts it on the person that we're charged with serving and that we're working for. There are a lot of pros and cons and changes in how we work and even in how we think that this evaluation process can really be an eye-opener. Our values will guide you. Take that information and move forward with your improvement plan, and it's a real learning experience for everyone. And with this, I am going to pass the presentation to Sapana.
Thank you, Ruth. That was a great overview of the 7 components of recovery-oriented agency. And what I'd like to do is to sort of continue the conversation with respect to the focus on the quality of life for the persons that we provide services for, and also talk a little bit about continuing the evaluation process. So the next slide really talks about quality of life outcome domains, and I'm not going to go through each one of these, but really just to sort of put these up and sort of think about, encourage the participants to think about, some of these quality of life outcome domains and how these may be measured within your agency, and thinking about how these may be, sort of outcomes or topics that come up within your interactions with the folks that you're working with. Now, how do we actually identify possible outcome measures? And some of the outcome measures that we know and that we're hearing more about as of late include how to avoid, hospitalization and ER visits. A recovery-oriented system of care really tries to work towards keeping people within their community and in working towards their recovery. How to get them employment. How do we think about outcomes such as, for housing, whether a person's been in a stable and safe environment, and how do we think about not only their sort of behavioral health and substance use, problems that they face, but also their medical wellness overall. And just to sort of summarize, I think that we can't just rely on one provider to do this. The relationships that we have are so key to form this culture of healing. And so when you ask and share and connect, I think that's when we really sort of start to work together to work towards recovery. And it's really a team effort. So next steps, I want to sort of conclude and provide folks some opportunity to ask questions, although most questions can also be directed towards the MCTAC website and the MCTAC question email address, which we'll provide you with at the end of this webinar. But how can you promote your agency and your services that are provided towards a recovery-oriented vision? And I want all of the participants to take a few minutes to think about this. How can you support change? And some of that starts with establishing a recovery-based mission and ensuring that the support services are consistent with that mission, and making sure that, this is really not something that's, one-directional, but that service participants are involved in all phases of the planning and delivery and evaluation. We also want to ensure that our outcomes over process are collected and used in terms of quality of life as well as recovery-based indicators and not just biomedical measures. Encourage teamwork and positive relationships. Again, collaboration is key. And next steps, just to provide some guidance for the participants that are on the webinar with us today, what what can you do? What can you take away from this webinar? So we've provided some sort of overarching components of recovery-oriented agencies, and one thing you can do is review these at your agencies. Identify practices that support these, as we've done through some of our great chat box questions, some additional areas and changes that you may want to implement. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration domains and principles are also a good guiding source and resource to use as you continue to work on this within your agencies. And I just want to conclude to be mindful of time that by saying that if there are any other questions, we're happy to have you know, some question-answer dialogue. If you can contact us at the mctac.info@nyu.edu website. And our next webinar will be next Wednesday, and we'll be talking more about, you know, the recovery-oriented system of care, the culture, and how to actually implement the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle and quality of improvement and its importance with all of the shift towards and the paradigm shift towards recovery-oriented systems of care. So I just want to conclude and invite my colleagues to thank you for participating on the webinar with us today. We're grateful for your feedback and for the dialogue, and we look forward to continuing on with this training series. So thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you for joining us.